So it's always a pleasure to be back in Japan and an opportunity to talk to you, and again talk about Ayn Rand's ideas, which I think are so important. So, in introducing the concept of individual rights and talking about the concept of individual rights, I want to first, before we get to kind of what's going on in China or what might be relevant for us in the Pacific Rim or in the United States or globally. I think what's really important is first to understand why we should care for us, and then we can think about them. Why do we care about freedom? Why do we care about liberty? What's in it for us when it comes to freedom and liberty? In many parts of the world, there's this notion that freedom that people have in their hearts. Everybody wants to be free. But 99.99% of human history, people have lived unfree lives and just lived them without complaining. Or if they complained, without doing anything about it. The natural, if you will, condition under which human beings have evolved since the beginning of time has been unfree. And unfree, I mean, where coercion, force, has been applied to them. They've been told what to do, and they've been doing what they were told to do. Most of our ancestors, almost all of our ancestors, were unfree. And, unless you have some aristocratic blood in you and you were part of the masters who told everybody what to do. And even they are not really free. They're dependent on the serfs to do what they say. Otherwise, they don't last very long. And of course, they're dependent on the other masters to not come and slaughter them and kill them. So there's very little evidence to suggest that freedom is just there and just waiting to gush out. We see time and time again, countries, peoples have the opportunity to embrace freedom and turn away from it. We see countries that have been free turn authoritarian. So freedom is an achievement. Freedom is something that takes real intellectual work and a real cultural commitment to it. And for freedom to become the dominant view, the dominant approach in a culture, has to be a certain attitude. It has to be clear to people. It has to be clear why we should be advocates of freedom. So why freedom? Why freedom? Why liberty? Well, freedom and liberty are important if you care about your life. If you want to live the best life that you can live. And if you believe you have the tools to be able to live such a life. So, for example, if you're taught from when you're very young that your mind doesn't matter, that reality, maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't, only, the Pope knows. Truth comes from an ancient book or from some form of revelation. And you have to have experts to tell you how to live, what to do, and that's your only option because you are impotent when it comes to actually conceiving of a good life. Then freedom is not very valuable to you. What are you going to do? You're dependent on them anyway. You're impotent. Your mind is impotent. Your ability to live is constrained. So you're dependent on somebody else for your own life anyway. So why be free? If you think about many religious cultures, do not embrace freedom for that reason. Because there's an authority. Who am I? We just do what's written in the book. We don't think for ourselves. So one of the first ideas that you have to have if you're going to establish freedom is the efficacy of the individual's mind, the efficacy of reason, our ability to think, to understand reality, to know reality, and therefore to act on our own behalf based on our own judgment. And that our own judgment is valid. That we don't rely on some mystical ability to commune, to know anything. If you will, you can think of this, there's a sense in which this struggle around freedom goes back, at least in the West. You'll have to tell me, what the parallels are, if there are any in Japan. But it goes back to kind of this debate between Plato and Aristotle, right? Plato tells us what? That where do you find knowledge? You find knowledge in some other dimension. And only certain people have the ability to discover that knowledge. And most of us will never know, will never see real reality, will never be able to judge for ourselves. So politically, that leads to an idea of a philosopher king, somebody who can get that knowledge and therefore rule over us. And it's in our interest to do what he says, because he's the one who knows what's really going on. We're ignorant. We just don't know. He has this metaphor of a cave. We're just in a cave looking at shadows, right? They can see the real world. They can see the sunlight. Versus Aristotle, who tells us, no. The world, we can see it, and we can understand it, and we can discover knowledge for ourselves. And in a sense, that's the battle over freedom. It's a battle over the human mind. It's a battle over the idea of whether you control your life, but also whether you can know the world out there. It's not an accident, therefore, that this idea of political freedom, political liberty, comes out of an age called the Age of Reason, comes out of the Enlightenment, comes out of a period in which, in Europe, they rediscover the idea of reason, the efficaciousness of reason, our ability to discover the world. It's not an accident that that period, the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, is also known as the Age of Science. Newton and what follows in all the scientific discoveries that happened during the 18th and 19th century. So we want to be free, or should want to be free, because we want to be able to use our own mind, our own judgment, to pursue our own values, so that we as individuals can be happy. So, underlying this idea of rights and this idea of political freedom are really two concepts: the efficacy of reason and individualism, the sanctity of the individual, the value of an individual, the fact that individual life matters. Indeed, it's all that matters in a sense, politically. So individualism and reason, individuals using their reason in pursuit of their values, in pursuit ultimately of their happiness. That's what we want freedom for. We want freedom so we can pursue our happiness. We want freedom so we can use our own judgment to pursue happiness, not be told what happiness is, not be told what actions to take, not be told what values to pursue, but choose them for ourselves. Now, that is kind of the philosophical context for the idea of freedom. And to realize that, to make it real politically, we need something that bridges these moral ideas about the sanctity of the individual, these epistemological ideas which are about the efficacy of reason, and the political idea of liberty. And that's what individual rights, that's the purpose of this concept of individual rights. It's a bridging concept between the idea of individualism, in the idea of the sanctity of the individual, the idea of the pursuit of happiness, and the idea of freedom. What do individual rights say? What do they mean? What are individual rights? And really, individual rights, again, come out of the writing primarily, as we understand them, of John Locke, the British philosopher in the 18th century, early 18th century, But they're really the predecessors in other thinkers in Europe during the previous 50 to 100 years. But the idea of individual rights is the idea that you as an individual are valuable, and therefore you as an individual are an end in yourself, and therefore you should have the freedom. Freedom from what? Freedom means what? Means the absence of force, the absence of coercion, the absence of an authority telling you what you can and cannot do. So you as an individual should have the freedom to use your mind in pursuit of your values. That's what individual rights mean. It means that the government, the authority, the governing body must leave you alone to live your life as you see fit. It should only intervene to protect your rights. So the purpose of government, according to Rand, according to this kind of line of thought, is the purpose of government is only to protect your freedom, to protect your rights, to protect your ability to act on your own behalf, to act in your own interest, to act in pursuit of your own happiness. But otherwise, leave you alone. And that's why, in the American Declaration of Independence, they say, we'll all have an inalienable right to life, which means to live our life as we see fit, based on our judgment, our mind, in pursuit of our values. Liberty, which means we can think, we can talk, we can write, free of coercion, free of force. Unfortunately, they left out property. In the original, there was property there as well. But that is, we can keep the product of our labor. We can keep what we earn. It's ours. That's what property means. It's the ability to earn and to keep what you earn, and pursue your happiness, which is the ultimate goal of all of this. Okay? And that is what government is constituted to protect. Not to give you, not to define, but to protect. And that's what we have a constitution, is to create a government that's sole purpose is the protection of that. I think the Japanese constitution has the pursuit of happiness in it, was the goal of government. I think General MacArthur put it in there. So individual rights are this concept to protect the individual from other individuals, but importantly to protect the individuals from the authorities, from government. It's to limit the scope of government, recognizing our individual liberty, our individual freedom, our individual rights to live our lives as we see fit. Now, as I think we all know, no government in the world has ever practiced this kind of limitation completely. Different governments violate our rights in different ways. All governments violate our rights to some extent, whether it's through coercion through taxation, or whether it's through, mask mandates, or whether it's through other types of mandates. We're mandated all over the place, whether it's through the regulation of business, what kind of business you're allowed to open, how you open it, what kind of permissions you need in order to do whatever it is that you need to do. All of those are acts of coercion, acts of force that constrain our liberty. In the name always of what? What's the purpose? Why do they do this? In the name of what? Yeah, in the name of protecting you, or protecting what they call the common good, the public interest. Which is a way of negating you as an individual, because so one of two alternatives they have. One is to argue that it's good for you and you don't know what's good for you, which is a return to the Platonic attitude of, we know what's good for you. We're the philosopher kings. We understand, so we're going to impose this on you because it's good for you. That's one way in which they justify it. And the second way to justify it is, we know it's not good for you, but it doesn't matter it's good for the group. And then they negate the concept of individualism. Note that they always negate one of two. Either they negate your reason, or they negate your individualism, the value of you as an individual. in order to use coercion against you. All governments do that, to some degree or another. But some governments do it more, and some governments do it much more. And there is a real difference between governments that are like what we saw in the pictures, and between what most of our governments, Japanese government, American governments, and so on, do. Now, it's to some extent an issue of degree, but there is a fundamental difference between the two. Because most of our societies, or Western societies, what we call Western societies, and I include Japan as a Western society in that sense, are societies that we still view as free. We're not as free as we'd like them to be. We're not as free as I think they should be. There's still way too much coercion, way too many mandates, way too much government controls and government regulations, the government's telling us what to do. So what is the difference fundamentally between a regime like China, or even worse, North Korea, and something like the United States and Japan? Well, I think there are a few things that are clear markers that make a significant difference. Right? One is, and maybe in a sense the most important one, is the issue of freedom of speech. Can you speak? Can you argue? Can you debate? Can you make your voice heard? See, yes, there's coercion imposed, but can I stand up and say, this is wrong? And here are the arguments, and here's my reasons, and hey, I'm trying to convince people that this is wrong so we can do something about it. Do you have that ability? That is a marker of a relatively free society, that you can do that. We can still do that in the United States. You can still do that in Japan. You can still do that in many countries around the world. But you can't do it in China. And you can do it in China today less than you could 5 years ago or 10 years ago. That is, the direction China's heading is clearly away from free speech. Right? So I remember being in China 10 years ago and being able to say all kinds of things about freedom and liberty and why the Chinese government was wrong and why the way they were running things was wrong. And already, just before COVID in 2019, you could say a little bit less, or you could say it, but now people were hesitant to come, and hesitant to listen, and hesitant to debate, and today I wouldn't go. Right? So we've seen a slow decline in China, in freedom of speech, but you see it also today in the United States. Right? You see this decline in the ability to have this debate. It's not yet at the point where the government is imposing it, but there's a shift in the culture. We've become a culture that doesn't want to debate certain things, that certain things are unacceptable to talk about, that you can't say. Certain speakers are not permitted to speak at universities. Now, the universities can choose who they want to have speak and who they don't want to have speak. It's within their rights, so it's not a rights violation, but it's a cultural attitude that is against the idea of speaking, debating, arguing, using reason to solve issues. And again, this is in America. We mostly hear about woke. We mostly hear about the problems on the left, but there are similar problems on the right. It is a culture-wide phenomenon. They just have different topics that you can't talk about. There's different issues that are unacceptable to both left and right. So freedom of speech is a right, is part of those right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This is the heart of liberty, is the ability to speak, is to argue ideas, to convince people, to try to reason with them, to try to change their mind, to try to move them along in your direction. The second characteristic of a free society is that you don't have, and it's related, I think, to free speech, is that you don't have political prisoners. You put people in jail for real crimes, which means when they violate somebody else's rights, when they use force against somebody, when they use fraud against somebody, when they really violate, you don't put people in jail for their ideas, their political actions, their political points of view, what they wrote, what they did. Again, for the most part, our countries don't have political prisoners. We put a lot of people in jail for things that are not necessarily violating somebody else's rights. We can talk about that if you want. But we don't put them in jail yet for their political activity. We don't use the government to try to screen out unacceptable people from a political perspective. Right? Again, the tide is turning, I think, a little bit in the West about this, and we have to be cautious. But at least we don't do that. In China, clearly they do. Clearly they have political prisoners, and in every regime that is an authoritarian regime, what you find are people placed in jail for their points of view about the government. Russia is a good example. Not only in Russia are they being put in jail, but there's this phenomena of Russians falling out of windows. I don't know if you've heard about this, but every week some Russian official, usually from the oil and gas industry, dies, and often they're dying by dropping out of a window. Suicide, they're depressed, accidents. Suddenly, a lot of Russians are slipping and falling from high places. It's very strange. But just on the flight here, I read of another minor oligarch, I guess, who has died. So you could kill your opponents, political opponents. You could put them in jail. But one way or another, your political opponents are being silenced. So Russia, technically, is a, quote, democracy, right? They vote. But if you can kill all your political opponents, then, yeah, you're the only man standing. Voting doesn't matter. Right? Remember the poisoning? Right? They've tried to assassinate through poisoning. They've used radioactive material to poison people. So Russia is well known as a regime that has eliminated its political opponents. And that's when you know you're not free. If you have a particular point of view, you risk being assassinated. Of all the countries I've visited, and I've given speeches in, 50, 60, 70 countries, the country where I felt the most constrained, the most a little fearful was Russia. I mean, China was in again, 2019 and before, no problem. Could say anything, and the audience was very open, and there was a lot of debate and discussion. Russia, it was very cold, partially because the people there are a little colder. Chinese are very friendly and vivacious people generally. The Russians are very close. But partially, I said I said this years ago, I think probably in 2015 or 2016, somebody asked me something about Putin at a talk I gave, and I said, he's a thug, he's a gangster. And everybody in the audience kind of went, you can't say that, you have to, what are you doing? Well, don't ask me if you don't want to hear my answer, right? So Russia is very much on this authoritarian line. Iran, obviously North Korea. You can tell the regimes in which this is happening. Turkey is, kind of in a gray area, but certainly some political opponents have been put in jail. But you still don't get that, right? You don't get that in most of Europe. You don't get that in South Korea, here, Taiwan. I was going to say Hong Kong, but can't say Hong Kong anymore, right? So that's two, and they're highly related. And the third is the fact that we have elections, the fact that we can choose our political leaders. Now, many of us argue that there's not much of a choice when you have to choose between Biden and Trump. I mean, but you still get to choose. You get to argue. You get to run yourself. You get to start a new political party. You get to be engaged in a political process. You get to have some kind of say in what's going on in the country. You can get people excited and get people to change their minds. It's happened. One of the great examples in the United States is kind of the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery in the 19th century. I mean, they changed people's minds. Slavery was very much entrenched in the United States in the early 19th century, and during the first half of the 19th century, leading up to the Civil War, people's minds were changed by people advocating for this group, women's right to vote. That was a change that people brought about through a process of arguing and deliberating and ultimately bringing about political force, political power, right? And that happened in country after country after country, all over Europe and America and spreading out in the rest of the world. So the fact that we can really, truly influence the political process, right? Not maybe as individuals, but at least we can get together as groups and have an impact. So those would be the three criteria for the difference between a free country and an oppressive country. Now, why should we care about the fact that somewhere else there is an authoritarian regime? Why should we care about Putin's thuggery and China's oppression of its own people, its violation of their rights? Clearly they are using force to dictate how people should live, what they can say, what they can think, what they can do, how they should live. And in China, it used to be that at least in business, they would leave you alone. Maybe you'd have to bribe the right people, but once you bribe the right people, they'd leave you alone. And that's changed in the last few years. We saw that with Jack Ma, and he said something negative about the Chinese central bank and their policies, or the Chinese treasury, and suddenly he was silenced and shunned away, and the value of his companies tanked. And since then, we've seen more regulations and more controls over businesses and over, even in the technology space, where the Chinese had before pretty much left it alone.